What happens when two radio presenters decide they're going to save British wrestling? Because in 2002, at a time when British wrestling was still seen by many people as a relic of the past, two men genuinely believed they could bring it back to mainstream attention. And for one night at Crystal Palace National Sports Centre, it looked like they might actually pull it off. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Instagram at The Wrestling Comedian and over on TikTok at Wrestling Comedian. Hello everyone, I'm Josh Faulkner, the Wrestling Comedian, and this is the story of British wrestling revival. Now, to understand why this show mattered, you need to understand where British wrestling was in 2002. While the sport had been gone for years, joint promotions was dead, Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks were part of television history, and while wrestling still existed in Britain, it had become fragmented. You had established promoters running, you had passionate fans, but there was no national platform, no real buzz, no sense that British wrestling mattered on a large scale anymore. At the same time though, there was something happening underneath the surface. The internet was growing, tape trading was growing, and the new generation of British wrestlers were emerging that looked completely different from the old world of sports stereotype. Fast-paced, athletic, influenced by Japan, ECW, Mexico, and the independents in America. And two people who recognized that potential were Tommy Boyd and Alex Shane. Now, Tommy Boyd was already a well-known television and radio personality. Alex Shane, on the other hand, was a wrestler, promoter, and somebody absolutely obsessed with pushing British wrestling forward, and together, the pair hosted Wrestle Talk on TalkSport Radio, which at the time was one of the few places in British media where wrestling was actually discussed seriously. And somewhere along the line, they decided, why don't we run our own wrestling show? Not just another indie event, something ambitious, something that felt important, something that could announce British wrestling was back. And that became British Wrestling Revival in 2002 at Crystal Palace National Sports Centre. And honestly, on paper, this card was ridiculous for British wrestling at the time. The centrepiece of the show was a tournament to crown the King of England, and the tournament was won by one of the defining names of that generation, Jody Fleisch. Now, if you weren't around British wrestling in the early 2000s, it's difficult to explain just how revolutionary Jody Fleisch felt at the time. British audiences had seen technical wrestling before, they'd seen heavyweights before, but Jody Fleisch moved differently. Him and Johnny Storm especially brought this explosive, high-flying style that genuinely felt ahead of British wrestling at the time. And speaking of Johnny Storm, the show featured what many fans still remember as one of the standout matches of the night. Jody Fleisch versus Johnny Storm in a ladder match. This wasn't normal in Britain back then. Ladder matches still felt special, still felt dangerous, still felt like something you only really saw in the WWE or ECW. So to have two British wrestlers tearing the house down like that in Crystal Palace felt massive. But the card wasn't just young British talent. You also had major international names. Grandmaster Sexay from WWE appeared on the show, which in 2002 still carried real star power with fans. And then there was Eddie Guerrero. Now this is before Eddie returned to WWE later that year. At this point, Eddie was out of the company and working independence, and British Wrestling Revival managed to bring him in to wrestle Doug Williams. And looking back now, that's an extraordinary piece of British wrestling history, because Doug Williams represented the absolute best of British technical wrestling at that time. So for British fans in 2002 to see that match live at Crystal Palace was genuinely special. The show also featured names like Robbie Brookside and Drew McDonald, two men who represented different sides of British wrestling. Brookside being this gritty, respected technician who'd worked all over the world, and Drew McDonald bringing that hard man heavyweight style that connected the older British scene with the newer independent generation. And then came one of the emotional moments of the entire night, because after Jody Fleisch won the King of England tournament, the Dynamite Kid Tom Billington appeared to present him with the trophy. Now, this was a huge deal. The Dynamite Kid had become almost mythical by that point. He wasn't somebody fans expected to see publicly anymore. His influence on wrestling was enormous, but his appearances were rare. So seeing the Dynamite Kid there in front of a British wrestling crowd presenting this trophy to the new generation, it genuinely felt symbolic, like the old guard handing something to the new era. And according to people who were there live, the atmosphere that night was incredible. Fans left Crystal Palace believing British wrestling was finally turning a corner, that this could be the beginning of something bigger. And then came the television broadcast, because the event was picked up by Bravo, which should have been huge national television exposure, exactly what British wrestling needed. But unfortunately, the broadcast became one of the biggest criticisms of the entire project. People who attended live talked about how electric the show felt, but when it aired on television, that energy just wasn't there. The editing was heavily criticised. Matches were chopped up awkwardly, the pacing felt strange, and instead of making British wrestling look revolutionary and exciting, a lot of viewers thought it looked low rent. Which was heartbreaking really, because by almost every live account, the show itself had succeeded. But television was supposed to amplify the momentum. Instead, many people feel it killed it. And this is one of the greatest what-ifs of British wrestling, because if British Wrestling Revival had been presented properly on television, could it have changed things sooner? Could British wrestling have broken through years earlier? Could companies like FWA have reached another level because the talent was there? That's the thing. The wrestlers were absolutely there. Jody Fleisch, Johnny Storm, Doug Williams, Robbie Brookside. This generation eventually became massively influential. But in 2002, British Wrestling Revival felt like the moment they were finally about to be seen nationally. And for one night in Crystal Palace, British wrestling felt important again. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments what's your favourite forgotten moment in British wrestling history. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, and remember, I'll see you on the next one.